NOTAMs are just a bunch of garbage that nobody pays any attention to. That was a quote, and it might sound quite harsh, but when it's the chairman of the NTSB who says it, and he genuinely did, then we have to ask, what actually are NOTAMs and why are they so bad? Stay tuned. Whenever there's a discussion about an aviation accident or incident, you may hear someone referring to the Swiss cheese model. Now, we use this model to show that in nearly all cases, accidents happen because of a multitude of factors, with each safety layer being like a slice of a Swiss cheese. Each of these cheese slices are supposed to be a safety barrier that should stop a tragedy from happening, but as we all know, Swiss cheese have holes in them, and in this model, these holes represent potential weaknesses in each barrier. When you stack multiple slices in front of each other, the cheese in one slice tends to cover the hole in the other and therefore stop a potential threat from becoming an accident. But unfortunately, sometimes the holes line up and an accident or incident happen. The reason NOTAMs are the target of many complaints right now is because a lot of people in the aviation industry have started to see them as a slice of cheese with a big hole in it, or even as a hole and not a safety barrier at all. So, what really are NOTAMs and where did they come from? Well, as is the case with so many other things in aviation, NOTAM seems to be something that aviation borrowed from the maritime industry. Mariners have access to something they refer to as notices to mariners, which is abbreviated as NOTMAR or NTM. The standards for these NOTMARs can vary from place to place, but what they are is important messages that mariners need to be aware of, ranging from regular notifications like the signal patterns of lighthouses and foghorns to more temporary things like new shipwrecks near to popular shipping lanes, for example. It's worth noting here that these NOTMARs are nicely spelled out in regular language, which is what they have evolved to do over the years, but that's a difference from its aviation cousin, which I will come to very soon. As I'm sure you've already guessed, in the aviation world, notices to mariners became notices to airmen, or NOTAMs. In the United States, the term's meaning recently changed to notices to air missions, although as far as we know, ICAO, the international aviation body that is run by the United Nations, still uses the original definition. That FAA name change has received, well, mixed reviews, to put it mildly, but I'm quite confident that most pilots would agree that the NOTAM system have far more serious problems than a name change to tackle. Either way, the purpose of NOTAMs is more or less the same as the NOTMARs, to keep pilots and other aviation professionals aware of possible dangers, generally temporary in nature, that might affect their flight. These could be, for example, changes in works in progress at an airport, or they could be things that could affect a flight en route, like navigation aids that is temporarily out of service or an approach that is not working. Now, I'll get to the real problems with NOTAMs shortly, but I know that many of you are probably wondering how NOTAMs came to have this strange code-like format that they're currently using. Well, this has actually developed over time, but its basic form hasn't changed much since the 1960s. To understand this, you have to imagine a world without the internet and instant access to information for everyone. Strange, I know. Even though the internet was many years away, airports and authorities still needed to make sure that everyone received these really important messages about potential safety hazards. So the basic format of NOTAMs dates back to when information was transmitted using technologies like telex, which was basically a slightly more advanced and automated form of the telegraph. And that's why NOTAMs are made up of short letter and number codes arranged in a specific format that explains the location, date and time of the event, its type and duration, and whether it's an update to a previous NOTAM, and so on. NOTAMs had to be short, containing as much information as possible, and that's how this code language came to be. Now, the problem here isn't only the cryptic nature of the NOTAM format, because we also have other things in aviation written and communicated in similar ways, like observations and forecasts for weather or runway conditions, for example. But just the fact that NOTAMs are written in text only can become a problem when it includes coordinates of something that we have to look out for, like a military training area or the presence of volcanic ash or weather balloons. Of course, there are digital tools to help decode NOTAMs, but figuring out if a set of coordinates given in latitude and longitude is relevant to our flight is not very straightforward, to say the least. Just imagine trying to, visualize a map in your head based on text. Of course, the importance of the NOTAM system became very obvious to everyone when they made the news this January because of a serious FAA system outage in the United States that affected thousands of both domestic and international flights. Now, as disruptions go, this wasn't as bad as other recent events, like the one that Southwest experienced around Christmas, but the FAA NOTAM outage was special because it was the first time since 9/11 that the FAA had to issue a ground stop for all flights in the United States. Now, I should say here that that's slightly misleading, because unlike what happened back in 2001, flights already in the air didn't have to land, and flights from abroad could continue and enter the country, so it was definitely less serious. The problem lasted a few hours, but the ground stop itself only lasted about an hour and a half. The result of the outage was that around 600 flights were cancelled and over 4,000 flights were seriously delayed. The whole issue created quite some nervousness around the industry, because an abrupt disruption like that could also trigger other problems by overwhelming airline systems, again like what happened to Southwest over Christmas. So what was it that actually caused this fault in the FAA NOTAM system? Well, it turned out that this was a simple procedural error. An engineer working in the early morning on January 11th replaced a database file at the wrong time while he was doing some routine system maintenance. Ironically, this was part of a process that involved a live primary NOTAM database and a backup one designed specifically to stop any outage from happening. Initially, there were some theories that foul play might have been involved, but the FAA later clarified that there was no evidence of a cyber attack. This was a simple but very, very expensive mistake created by the human factor. Now, the FAA is working on ways to make sure that such a simple error can't bring down the whole country's aviation sector again, but the key point here is why airline operations had to stop in the first place. Having access to accurate and up-to-date information about what can affect our flights is something that all pilots need at the briefing stage. Our flight planning, pre-flight briefings and in-flight decision-making depends on having all of the right information, and this obviously includes NOTAMs. If the NOTAM system is down, like what happened here, then this planning cannot go ahead, and that's why everything just grinds to a halt. But here is also where we run into the first problem of the NOTAM format, specifically with the having all the right information part. The volume of information in NOTAMs has steadily been increasing for the last few decades, and it has now reached truly ridiculous levels. Remember that NOTAMs don't just cover the origin and destination airport, they also cover all of the alternates and the en route portion of the flight, telling us about anything that could conceivably affect the flight while it's in cruise. And because of that, for long-haul flights, the NOTAM section can actually cause a cruise briefing package to balloon to over 200 pages, since so much needs to be covered. But that volume of information was only the first problem. The second one is inconsistency of the information provided. Now, in theory, all NOTAMs should follow very detailed ICAO guidelines who define both the format they should be having and the type of information that they should contain, but in practice things are much more complicated and much more infuriating. Many countries, including the United States, have their own long-established rules and habits on what is included in NOTAMs, but in other parts of the world, NOTAMs don't just vary from country to country in what they can contain, but sometimes they can even vary from airport to airport, meaning that the amount of and also type of information included can vary dramatically. This points to the next problem, which is overuse or even misuse of NOTAMs. When NOTAMs first appeared, they followed a similar format to NOTMARs, which meant that much of the information wasn't temporary in nature, it was actually permanent. Those early NOTAMs might have included things like a permanent difference in an approach procedure at an airport, for example. But today, such permanent information is published in other, better ways, like approach plates, for example, and therefore shouldn't be in NOTAMs, unless there has been a recent change that hasn't been published yet. But that detail isn't something that is applied consistently, meaning that pilots can often be faced with duplicated information, again making the amount of information that we need to absorb greater and also less relevant. And on top of that, this inflated and duplicated information often refuses to go away. In theory, NOTAMs should have a fixed duration of a maximum 3 months. Again, the idea is that if something lasts longer than this, then it's something permanent and should become part of a published procedure. But in practice, some NOTAMs stick around for much longer than that, again making them pretty much irrelevant. So far our list of NOTAM problems includes a high volume of information, inconsistency, overuse and sometimes even misuse, plus a lack of time limits for all the information. And of course, we also have that code format that they're written in, which is pretty far from being user-friendly in this modern day of digital tools. I mean, telex, really? But lastly, and perhaps most importantly of all, there is the question of prioritization, or in this case, the complete lack of prioritization. Back in the 1960s, when the number of NOTAMs that a flight crew had to browse through was maybe a few short pages, well then prioritizing that information wasn't a big, priority. Everything in those pages were likely important. But nowadays it's very different when the pilots need to look through dozens of pages with NOTAMs that can range from no lubricant available at the airport, or a crane is erected 4 nautical miles from the centerline, to the airport is closed, which can be hidden on row 15 on page 5. To be fair, it is likely not easy for someone to take responsibility for classifying if a NOTAM is more or less important than others, but there must be a better system than this. A number of events have shown that this prioritization and other changes to the NOTAM system is becoming really urgent. A couple of years back, I made a video on the Air Canada Flight 759 incident, which almost landed on a taxiway with 4 other aircraft on it. This crew knew that they were supposed to be landing on the right runway of the 2 runways available, because a NOTAM had informed that one of the runways would be closed after a certain time. But the pilots disregarded this NOTAM during the briefing process because they were supposed to arrive at the airport before that runway's closing time, so that NOTAM was regarded as less important than other ones. After a number of delays, the crew finally ended up on approach after the left of the 2 runways had closed and its lights had been switched off. This meant that the crew lined up their Airbus with what they thought was the right of the 2 active runways, which turned out to actually be a taxiway. Now, a quick-thinking pilot in one of the aircraft on the taxiway actually switched on their landing lights, illuminating the aircraft in front of them just seconds before what could have become a major accident. In an NTSB video of the incident, you can clearly see how close that aircraft came to the others on the taxiway. Now, to be clear, poor understanding or consideration of NOTAMs was far from the only factor in that incident. But that's not really the point. All incidents and accidents involve multiple factors and protections, each of which is a slice of that cheese model that I talked about. The point here is that the NOTAM that informed this Air Canada flight crew about the closed runway and the timing of the closure was on page 8 of a 27-page briefing package. It also didn't help that they were a reserve crew that were called in to perform this flight in last minute, which likely limited their briefing time. The statement that NOTAMs are just a bunch of garbage that no one pays any attention to, which I quoted in the beginning of the video, came from Robert Zumwalt, who was the chairman of America's National Transportation Safety Board when he made that statement. He said it during an NTSB campaign aimed at modernizing NOTAMs and stopping them from overloading pilots with high volumes of inconsistent, misused, outdated and unprioritized information. Air Canada Flight 759 has become one example of the failure of the NOTAM format, but there have been many more. A recent report from Australia's Transportation Safety Bureau explained how a Virgin Australia crew misinterpreted the NOTAM, thinking that there was a displaced threshold on a runway, meaning that they should land further in than normal. This crew landed safely, but they did so about 850 meters or 2,800 feet further down the runway than they should have. And about 2 weeks later, another crew did exactly the same thing, since the NOTAM had not been updated or clarified. Now, there are some initiatives out there aimed at improving the NOTAM system. The FAA have been updating its NOTAMs, for example, so that they follow ICAO standards more closely to ensure consistency. ICAO has its own projects focusing on getting rid of outdated NOTAMs, which they estimate to be 20% of all NOTAMs globally. Eurocontrol and others are working to make NOTAMs more usable and compatible with digital tools to help get rid of a format that was obviously designed for paper and a time long gone. And the airlines have come up with their own digital tools that work around the problems by automatically highlighting certain NOTAMs for their crews. But what we really need to do here is to realize that this system was supposed to be a layer of protection in the cheese model, not a huge potential hole. I think that we as an industry needs to sit down and redesign the system from scratch to make it better and more adapted to the world that we actually live in. Because there is a reason that we don't use telex anymore. I hope that the NOTAM system and its shortcomings is making more sense to you now, and if you want to learn more about the industry, well then check out this playlist up here. If you want to help me and my team research and make these videos, well then consider sending a super thanks or buy some awesome merch. There's links in the description here below, or you can also join my fabulous Patreon crew. We convene for Zoom hangouts now and then, and I'd love to see you there. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.